The Pokémon series has a long history of spin-offs, but in the grand scheme of things, very few actually have much in common with the main series' RPG gameplay. While there have been a handful of battle simulators over the years, most of them don't really utilize the signature catching and battling gameplay. That is, other than the Ore duology, which began and ended on the GameCube in the mid-2000s. These games were really interesting when they first released, with a brand new studio at the helm releasing these games on completely different hardware. Instead of running around and catching Pokemon to beat the 8 gym leaders and tackle the Elite Four, the team at Genius Sonority instead tasked the player with saving Pokemon from an evil organization that was transforming them into fighting machines. The first entry, Pokémon Colosseum, really left a big impact on me when it was released in 2003, but it would eventually see a sequel in 2005 known as Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness. Pokémon XD was a welcome return to the Ore region and looked to be another solid Pokémon experience for the GameCube. I distinctly remember reading about Pokémon XD in Nintendo Power magazines while waiting for news for the new Zelda game. It was among the short list of games that wrapped up that generation for Nintendo and helped fill out the console's limited library of RPGs. But when it first came out, it actually took me a while to get around to playing it. I don't know if it was just me, but Pokémon Colosseum left more of an impact than XD did, probably because of the GameCube's dwindling popularity. When Colosseum was coming out, there were ads on TV and magazines and all sorts of stuff, but Pokémon XD kinda just came and went. Despite that, today, Pokémon XD has a lot going for it, and it seems that the fanbase considers it to be the better of the two games. Pokémon XD would introduce a lot of new features that improved the general experience from Colosseum, but I just never really came back to it, even though I've replayed Colosseum plenty of times. I think that's in part due to the later release date and the ways that XD differs from Colosseum. Colosseum, for many reasons, appealed to me personally as a standalone RPG with a bold new take on this franchise, but I've always felt that Pokémon XD didn't capture those same feelings. Colosseum was clearly an effort to make Pokemon cool and interesting for older kids, but XD, despite its edgy exterior, actually kinda steps back to the safety of the established brand. At least that's how I felt when I first played the game forever ago. So that's sort of why I want to come back to this one and look through it again. So I hope you'll join me as we take one more deep dive into the Ore region with Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness. I'm going to try to keep things mostly relevant to XD, but I am going to be referring to Pokémon Colosseum a lot in this video, so if you haven't seen my original video on Colosseum, I would recommend watching that first. Pokemon XD begins with a cruise liner known as the SS Libra, sailing in the oceans of the Ore region. Suddenly, the ship is attacked by a fleet of helicopters and a mysterious purple Lugia that raises the ship out of the water and carries it into the night. Cut to a simulated battle with some high-level Pokemon, and we're introduced to our main character. Starting out with a cold open battle right away is fun and new, especially for the time XD came out. I went with the default name Michael here, even though I never felt like it was as important as it was in Colosseum to keep the original name, since he's really just a kid that doesn't really have too much of a backstory. Michael is considered by his friends to be somewhat of a prodigy in battling, and he uses this simulator at the research lab he calls home to test his skills. He lives at the lab with his mother Lily, sister Jovi, and the lab director Crane. This battle proficiency should be the case for all playable characters in the main series. It gives a bit of a justification for all these 11-year-olds wiping the floor with everyone. Michael is a bit of a blank slate compared to Wes in the previous game. This is even characterized by his starter Pokemon, a level 10 Eevee he was given from his dad, who I believe was also a scientist that passed away sometime between Colosseum and XD. I've just always felt like Wes gave Colosseum a very distinct identity with a more experienced protagonist, and Michael with his big goofy eyes is kind of a departure from that identity. Even the tone of the game has changed a lot. Colosseum started with an explosive heist, but XD starts with a mystery and hide and seek. It's just a different game. Looking for his sister leads Michael to Kaminko's Manor south of the lab. Visually, this courtyard gives me such a GameCube-y vibe. Maybe it's just the empty square that's just detailed enough and also still somewhat rudimentary, or maybe it just reminds me of Luigi's Mansion. You'll soon get into your first battle against literally the weakest Pokemon in the game, and then meet up with your sister. This section has a lot of setup for characters. I noticed that there's just a lot of scientists and technology about in XD, but in a way I think it really shows how much Ore has changed in the years since Colosseum. The two head back to the lab, and Professor Crane gives Michael the new snag machine to try out. But as soon as that happens, a bunch of sketchy guys show up to kidnap Crane, and they have a Shadow Pokemon in tow, the first seen in half a decade. Shadow Teddiursa is really here just to show you how to snag Pokemon, and also functions as a way to give you at least 2 Pokemon in your team. XD follows the double battle formula that the previous game did, so you have to have at least 1 more Pokemon if Eevee was gonna have any shot. Teddiursa is the first main party member you can add to your team, and I think it is a popular choice. Ursaring that it evolves into is the kind of Pokemon that doesn't really have an opportunity to be used in a normal game playthrough, so it is cool to get one so early on. I typically try to avoid using Pokemon that I already have when I first play the game, and I'm 90% sure I used an Ursaring, so I'm probably not going to use Teddiursa here. Regardless, Crane does get taken away, and there's nothing that you can do to stop him. With a new Shadow Pokemon in the world though, the rest of the lab restarts work on the purification machine they'd been developing. That leaves Michael and Jovi to set out to nearby Gateon Port to pick up the parts they need and search for the professor. And that sets you off into the rest of the game. Gateon Port is a bright ocean town, but it seems to have a bit of a rough side. Like this guy who has no eyes and picks a fight with an 8-year-old. But just as he challenges you, some strangers show up and deal with him. The big guy gets taken out by these definitely not sketchy people, and you can freely explore the town a bit. This is a simple, small area, but it is brand new to Ore. There just isn't much to do here. There's a Krabby-themed club, and a bunch of sailors you can talk to, and a lighthouse that you can explore to find some goodies. Cipher, who originally tried to create Shadow Pokemon in order to rule over Ore, has been gone for some time, and it really shows. Gateon Port is a symbol that the place has evolved quite a bit in the short few years since the first Cipher incident. There are more people and Pokemon all throughout the region. Some of the rough edges that Ore used to have are still around, but it's just generally a safer place. You do get to pick what's effectively your starter Pokemon here though. Instead of the preset pair of Espeon and Umbreon from Pokemon Colosseum, Michael instead gets to choose from any of the existing evolutions from the time. I guess you could also just not evolve Eevee, but Flareon and Umbreon don't have the best tools in Generation 3, and the Johto Eevees already served as starters in Colosseum, so for me that sort of left Vaporeon and Jolteon. I came really close to choosing Vaporeon, but I caved and went with Jolteon. I think that's sort of become the canon choice as well. It just feels like the correct choice. There's basically no point in keeping it as an Eevee, so I went ahead and evolved it on the spot too. There are a few spots to collect some more Shadow Pokemon here. If you explore, you can find a Shadow Poochyena or Ladybug, but they're likely not going to stay on the team for long. Other than that, there just isn't a lot going on here. You can chat up the locals a bit and explore this Krabby Club, but once you're done that, it's time to grab those parts and head back to the lab. The Purify Chamber is still under construction, so Lily sends you out to Agate Village to meet Egon, the Elder there, and learn more about purifying Shadow Pokemon. At this point, I was getting a little bit tired of all the running around that XD puts you through, and thankfully returning to a familiar location like Agate brings along some variety. Once you arrive, you're given free access to the whole town to look around. A lot of the nooks and crannies of the village are still around, with some new goodies to find in them, as well as a move teacher that can give Jolteon Thunder Wave early. This will come in very handy when Shadow Pokemon show up more often, so I picked it up. This area sets you up with plenty of battles as well if you want. Going through the majority of them let Teddiursa clear up the bulk of his heart meter, and I think this is a good time to go over what's changed with Shadow Pokemon. Shadow Pokemon work fundamentally the same as they did in Pokemon Colosseum, where instead of gaining experience, they instead clear out a heart meter that needs to be fully empty by battling with them, so that you can later purify them and return them to normal. But Gale of Darkness makes a few small and meaningful changes to the mechanic to make it a lot more manageable. To start, it feels much easier to purify Pokemon, and the meter empties out much faster. Along with that, the Hyper Mode mechanic has been entirely replaced by Reverse Mode. The two seem the same at first glance, but Reverse Mode is generally more forgiving. Hyper Mode in Colosseum had a few benefits along with the debuffs, but Reverse Mode is a blanket bad thing. Your Pokemon will hurt itself every turn like it's poisoned when you're in Reverse Mode. Even if Hyper Mode's benefits were pretty unintuitive, the change makes Reverse Mode feel somewhat simplistic. Another change is the addition of a dozen new Shadow Pokemon moves. This changed the recoil damaging Shadow Rush into an optional attack, and also added several status and special attack moves. But I think the most interesting change to the system is that all Shadow moves are now super effective on normal Pokemon, and not effective on other Shadow Pokemon. These changes are really good, but they do change how Shadow Pokemon feel to use. A lot of people probably thought that the Shadow Pokemon in Colosseum were too hard to handle, and the forced recoil was a frustrating mechanic, but I don't agree that made the system too difficult. I do enjoy the type effectiveness changes though, and it's tonally consistent that Shadow Pokemon would resist their own attacks and be better against normal Pokemon. That change in particular does add a bit of flair to the combat, and has you thinking a bit more about what to target with your Shadow Pokemon. But by and large, I don't think making the system easier to manage was the way to go, and it is a bit disappointing for me. I liked how Shadow Pokemon felt a bit feral and uncontrollable before. It made them a lot more distinct. Eventually, Egan will set you off on a short set of battles in Relic Forest, just below Agate Village. Between these battles and the ones scattered around town, Teddiursa was more than ready to be purified. I call them Rocky. For comparison's sake, in Pokemon Colosseum, it took me 7 hours to be allowed to purify Pokemon, but in Gale of Darkness, this has been shortened down to less than 2 hours. When I replayed Pokemon Colosseum, I was really happy to reach that point in Agate Village, where you get to unlock every Pokemon that you've had so far. Purifying Pokemon instead feels like something you just do here, instead of something that you had to work really hard to earn. I don't know if difficulty is the same as convenience in games, and so it is a bit up in the air whether these are better changes. It's really just my opinion. But objectively, Shadow Pokemon are much easier to handle in XD across the board. Now that we have a way to save our Pokemon, we're instructed to head to another familiar location, Mount Battle. Once Michael gets to Mount Battle, he once again runs into one of those sketchy guys from earlier. He doesn't have much to say, and you head up to the first few steps of the mountain to meet one of the leaders here, Vander. The Mount Battle challenge isn't really as important or emphasized, and you only really need a return here if you want to do some leveling. Soon enough, they turn you right back around and point you in the direction of the abandoned Shadow Pokemon lab, where it seems there's been some activity. I wish they gave you more time to settle into an area before having to jump to the next one, but what can you do? The Shadow Pokemon lab is the game's first real dungeon. As you arrive, you're immediately introduced to the Hexagon Brothers, a band of 6 colored Cipher peons. The Hexagon Brothers are the first major opportunity to start building a team, since each of them have a Shadow Pokemon with an associated type to their color. You don't have to, but battling each of them gives you a decent set of Pokemon to work with, including Houndour, Mareep, Spheal, Baltoy, Gulpin, and Seedot. These 6 Pokemon could give you a pretty rounded team on their own. There's also plenty of Pokemon to pick up inside the lab, so you've got a lot to choose from. The selection of Pokemon in Colosseum was incredibly limited, so it is cool to see how much more variety there is here so early on. I spent some time to go get some supplies partway through the dungeon, and remembered to rename my Jolteon. I called him Neo. The Hexagon brothers are really emblematic, though, of the major shift in direction for Pokémon XD in regards to the game's tone. You can see glimpses of it so far, but Gale of Darkness feels a lot more in line to me with the rest of the Pokémon franchise. Characters are generally more friendly here, and villains are typically goofier than before. The Cipher peons are just generally less threatening. It's almost like Shadow Lugia and the branding of Gale of Darkness function like a Trojan horse for all the normal, silly Pokémon stuff. XD just isn't as quote-unquote dark as Colosseum. I thought maybe the improvements to the animations and character models maybe just gave them more of a way to actually do what they intended with Colosseum, but I don't think that's necessarily true. I just find the average NPC in XD has this goofiness to them that just didn't match what they had before. I don't have any real evidence to support this, but I have a theory that the Pokemon Company just didn't like how much Pokemon Colosseum pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable for the brand, and XD was forced to follow a more family-friendly vibe because of it. This applies to the character designs, but even more so to the general world and story direction. Colosseum had some sillier moments, but it's clear that Pokemon XD stripped out a lot of that cool steampunk stuff and instead replaced it with a more colorful and cheerful tone. Instead of Wes's motorbike with a huge engine and roaring pipes, Michael hops on his little scooter and scoots his way around the region. Even the fact that the main character is so much younger is a big tonal shift. Things like this are all over Pokemon XD if you look for it, and it was honestly a big factor in what made this game less memorable for me when I first played it. Pokemon XD improves on a lot of things that the previous game did, but it does fall into the same routine. Battles run pretty long, and they take up a large portion of the game, especially in what I would consider the game's dungeons. The Shadow Pokemon Lab will have you battling through dozens of trainers as you make your way through, without too much in the way of exploration or puzzling. If you aren't a fan of Pokemon's combat system, or the long animations, this game won't convince you otherwise. Even still, I find these games somewhat relaxing in a weird way. It's always fun to just do Pokemon, gathering up a team and using them to make your way through the game. Back in the Shadow Pokemon Lab, eventually you'll find Crane locked up in an office with Naps, the Cipher peon that you met earlier. It looks like Cipher has returned after all, and they've taken over this Shadow Pokemon Lab once again in order to do some research for their newest project, XD001, which is going to be permanently corrupted and unpurifiable. Making your way back through the Shadow Pokemon Lab, eventually you'll run into the boss here, Lavrina. She reminded me a lot of the characters from Pokemon Trozy on DS. It turns out that James Turner worked as the art director on both of these games before moving on to the main series. So honestly, I think it's just bringing his art style to the Ore that has already been established that gave Pokemon XD this mild visual whiplash. I've really got nothing against James Turner and his work, but I just think that Lavrina and a lot of the admins in this game specifically look exceptionally strange when put beside the old characters. Being the first boss, she isn't all that much trouble. They've got what I assume is meant to be an attract-based team, but I don't think they had enough time to really set anything up before I'd already beaten them. First boss out of the way, Crane and Michael scoop up a data disk that they found on the ground and manage to get back to the lab safely. The purification chamber is finally complete at this point, which gives you a brand new way to purify your Shadow Pokemon. The Purify Chamber is a menu that you can access from any PC that lets you organize your purified Pokemon in this sort of system that helps return other shadow Pokemon to normal. Each terminal has a center slot for a shadow Pokemon to purify, and an outer ring where you place your regular Pokemon. You need to line up the outer ring in a way that their typing becomes effective on the next Pokemon in line. This system eventually can get to a point where it can easily purify any Pokemon that you throw at it, but for the time being it can only manage a bit at a time. The whole party I used through the previous area was ready to be purified anyway, so I don't have much use for the chamber at the moment. But Pokémon XD has a much larger roster of shadow Pokemon, so it's gonna be essential once the number of Pokemon in the box gets out of hand. It's one of those things that I think is just objectively better in Pokémon XD, because it gives you an opportunity to actually purify most of the shadow Pokemon instead of having to grind them all out. You could say that the technology has advanced in Ore in the past 5 years, that the natural methods in Relic Forest aren't really necessary anymore, but maybe that's just overly reading into it. That data disk from earlier turns out to be encrypted past anything people at the lab can handle, so Crane suggests a trip to Pyrite Town in order to meet with some of the people that helped defeat Cipher in the past. For a lot of reasons, I think Pyrite is one of the most iconic locations in Ore. It's the prime example of how different this region is compared to the ones in the main series games, and it's home to a lot of important characters as well. 5 years after the events in Colosseum, this version of Pyrite demonstrates just how much the region has advanced in that short time. The kids that used to live in the area below the city, known as the Under, have established the ONBS here, a large news station that really stands out compared to the rest of Pyrite. Raise a glass for the Under, by the way. That was the coolest location in Colosseum, and it just doesn't show up here ever. People still occupy the battle square in the center of town, but in XD, there aren't any shadow Pokemon around. They've just really cleaned up the town, and the entire region has seen similar changes. There's talk that wild Pokemon have also returned to Ore, and Pyrite's mayor, Duking, has been working on reintroducing them to areas just outside of town. So really until now, with Cipher's return, things in Ore had been going really well. After handing Net the data ROM, it's off to meet Duking and learn how to actually encounter these wild Pokemon. The region is still a desert for the most part, but with a few wild Pokemon migrating in, Duking has set up 3 of what they call Pokespots across the map. Since the wild Pokemon are so few and far between, it doesn't really work the same as it did in the other games. In each of these places, you can set a few snacks out to attract wild Pokemon to them, and then return once your PDA rings that something has shown up. This selection of Pokemon is also quite limited, with a total of 9 obtainable across 3 spots. I believe that there's a side quest of sorts where you can catch the rarer of these 9 and trade them with Duking for an additional 3 Pokemon, so I guess that brings the total to 12. I picked up this Sandshrew and I named them Jam. I think I'm going to add them to the team. The Pokespots are useful not only to add a few extra Pokemon to the party, but also to fill out the Purify Chamber. I caught this Aron and threw it in there, and its type advantage is really good for this. Really, my biggest complaint with the wild encounters, and this is something I remember not really liking when I first played the game, was that all these Pokemon are stuck at such low levels. If you want to use a wild Pokemon that you caught in XD, you really have to decide at this point, or you're going to need to grind them up to speed later. Checking on one of the Pokespots though, you re-encounter Mirror B and get to have a battle with them. Ever since his days with Cipher came to an end, he hasn't really been doing much other than scheming to steal Pokemon with his 2 lackeys. In XD, he functions as a second chance to catch any shadow Pokemon that you might have missed, and he'll continue showing up throughout the story, but with a minor role. Mirror B is such a likable character, so it totally makes sense they had to bring him back. After the battle though, we can return to the ONBS to check on their progress. Cipher has found the location of the stolen data disk and invaded the ONBS. This brings you to the second dungeon of the game. The battles so far haven't really been too difficult. This guy's Loudred had me worried for a moment, and I only managed to get by sleeping his Raichu and getting lucky. I don't really think that it's gonna get much worse until the very end of the game. But not everybody is safe yet, since Marcia, a friend of the kids, went to Phoenix City. That leaves Michael to head east and warn the mayor there that Cipher is coming. Oh, hey there. I didn't see you. If you're enjoying the video so far, this is stupid. If you're enjoying the video so far, I'd super appreciate it if you liked it or subscribed to the channel or commented on the video. All that stuff really helps out and makes the video more available to other people that might enjoy it too. So if you want to see more videos like this in the future, do all that stuff, help support, really appreciate it. Thanks. Back to the video. The moment that you enter Phoenix City, some lady shows up and gives you a battle CD case, and then forces you to head to the nearby Relgem Tower to go mess around there for a while. The Coliseum on top is still there, but the place has seen the addition of two major attractions, Battle Simulations and Battle Bingo. Battle Bingo is pretty intimidating at first glance and has you trying to clear out this board by defeating whatever Pokemon is in its place. And in the battle simulators, you have to do a sort of preset team battle where you've got to win under certain conditions. It reminded me a lot of some of the DS Yu-Gi-Oh games I used to play, where you had to win in a single turn or whatever, and that sort of turns the game into a puzzle. These are both fun enough distractions and serve as an alternative way to earn Poke Coupons for the Mount Battle prizes. I do really like how the battle sims push the mechanics of Pokemon in a way that makes them serve as fun side activities, but I'm not going to stay too long on them. Before I left though, I did have to stop by the shops here since they sell some really useful items like Fire Blast and Protect. Returning to Phoenix City, it's obvious that something is going on. Cipher peons have locked away half of the citizens and have been walking around disguised as them. This also includes the Hexagon brothers, who show up once again, and they all dress up as the pre-gym leader, Justy. Weirdly enough, this isn't the first time Cipher has shown their ability to disguise themselves as other people, since this exact same thing happened at the very end of Pokémon Coliseum in its post-game. You have to battle each of them to clear the area, and then you can head into the Coliseum to get a key to unlock the people locked in the gym's basement. This being the third major section of the game that's almost entirely reused from Pokémon Coliseum. It's too bad that they weren't allowed to give the players some more variety in this one, but I get that these aren't really the main entries with tons of budget to toss around. While I am a little critical of the ways that the game has reused assets so far, I do really like this spin on the idea. It turns Phoenix City into this big area full of battles that you have to do, and I think it's just a fun use of the premise. I kind of wish they went further with it and tried to gaslight you in some way to make you think that everything is actually normal. It's a little too obvious when you first show up. While you're battling all of the imposters running amok here, you can find one of the houses which has a bed in it that you can sleep to rest your Pokemon up. Healing stations like this are pretty plentiful throughout the game, but I found it a bit weird how it's handled. A lot of the time these beds feel like a band-aid solution, so you don't really have to run off to go to a Pokemon Center and heal your team up. But it just makes it feel like the team should just be healed after every battle automatically. It's still a waste of time, and it isn't like there's anything to stop you along the way. In the original Pokemon games, or most RPGs in general, random encounters are an aspect of game design that's meant to force the player to manage their resources. But with the lack of random battles in Pokémon XD, there are no obstacles between you and your next full heal. It's just whether or not you're lazy enough to walk there. Pokémon Coliseum has the same problem, and it's made worse by the longer distances in that game between healing stations, but I just wish they found a better solution for that here. When I play Pokemon games, I typically refuse to use items during battles, so most of the time I just use them to save myself some time instead of needing to walk to that healing area. Game design isn't simple. As I went through battling everyone in the city, a few of my Pokemon evolved. I have 5 Pokemon on the team, and an empty space occupied by this Shadow Snorunt. I'm planning to keep most of these guys on the team, but I am still shopping around for that 6th party member. Team composition in Pokémon XD is much easier than it was in Pokémon Colosseum, but I did sort of struggle getting really good move sets for my team. It could just be coincidental because of the Pokémon I chose to use, but most of them really didn't have a lot of moves that they would learn naturally by leveling, and I had to teach them all with TMs. The 3rd generation of Pokemon was the first to introduce double battles, and so the strategies were somewhat limited. So generally, if you aren't running Earthquake and a Flyer or something like that, it's not really like there's going to be much going on between teammates. But I'm pretty happy with the ones I chose. I honestly kind of zoned out for this part since it was just so much battling going on with all these guys. I didn't even notice when or why I was allowed inside Fennec Coliseum. I just battled everyone until this guy let me in. But once you're inside, you run into some Cipher guys and Marcia, who's been taken prisoner as they tried to do some news recordings. This is Cipher admin Snaddle, a goofy looking guy and the 2nd major boss. Even though most of them had evolved recently and had a bit of a power spike from that, I was taking just so much damage from their Shadow Lunatone. It just didn't want to be caught, and I had to resort to using my limited Ultra Balls to seal the deal. It's a funny thing though, I almost want to be slightly underleveled in these games to maintain that challenge and avoid having to grind, but I think my current team composition just has too many squishy attackers, and simply not enough Pokemon that can actually help set things up. I might have to reconsider some of my team members in the future, especially because I do recall that XD has some pretty difficult encounters ahead. Once the people of Fennec City were freed though, Justy gives Michael a tip that there's been some activity north of Fennec, further into the desert. Journeying deeper into the desert, Michael's scooter gets stuck in the sand and you can't go any further. As soon as you pull back into Fennec though, Net from the ONBS sends you an email about the missing Pokemon from the SS Libra. This sets you on a bit of a side mission to not only upgrade your bike, but also to help this little girl find her Bonsly. With Michael showing up on TV since the Fennec incident, he's become a bit of a local legend. You run around Ore for a bit, bouncing between Gateon Port, bumping into that old guy Varich again, and end up at Kaminko's lab, since he's been working with somebody that could upgrade the scooter. His assistant Chobin decides now is a great time to test out his Robo Groudon suit, which is this weirdly elaborate segment that feels like it should be a boss fight. Instead of fighting the actual robot like I thought you would, you instead just battle him a second time with a stronger team. This Robo Groudon and Kyogre will end up being a little more important later, but they do feel like just really random, confusing inclusions. Like, what is Robo Groudon even supposed to do? He tests it by battling you with his Pokemon and then talks like it was supposed to help him in some way. Maybe you were originally intended to fight the robot itself, but it's hard to say. Anyway, with the scooter finally upgraded, you can head out into the desert and reach the final resting place of the SS Libra. The Libra is such a cool inclusion in the game. I just wish it was more fleshed out. All things considered, the location is pretty small, with a few block puzzles that lead you to running into the 3rd Cipher admin, and he really freaks me out with his absurdly large head and tiny legs. But you don't battle him, instead taking on a few of his grunts. The SS Libra really gives me the feeling like you're supposed to be getting wild Pokemon encounters here. It's really strange, like I'm expecting to see a Zubat. But no, there's not much around, it's just an empty boat. Eventually, you meet this funny guy who's started living off of the remains of the ship, and he says that there's some strange noises coming from inside the boat. It ends up being that girl's bonsai that you were looking for. You sneak up on the Pokemon, but when you try to catch them, you actually get an email that scares it off, and you can later find it at a Pokespot. Pokémon XD was coming out in the lead up to Diamond and Pearl on DS, and has 2 cameos from upcoming Pokemon, the other being Munchlax. If you check in on the Pokespots, there's a chance for you to run into a Munchlax, where it plays a short little event that's really just to show you that it exists. Their owner gives you some items for the trouble, but the whole thing feels like it was mostly included to be put on promotional material. I definitely saw some screenshots of this thing in magazines or websites or something like that. Later on in the game, you can use Bonsai in Battle Bingo too, which is a cool inclusion. And if you take the time to complete Bonsai Bingo, then you'll unlock this little card as a key item so you can admire Bonsai whenever you want. The Libra really should be Pokémon XD's most iconic location, but you spend a surprisingly little amount of time here. When I was trying to remember things about Pokémon XD before playing the game, I thought the Libra was way more important than it actually is. It's really just one of those areas that's unique to XD, but doesn't provide much else. After locating Bonsai, you walk outside and get cut off by a bunch of Team Snag'em guys. They jump Michael with their Gloom and make off with the Snag Machine. The squatter from before manages to take care of you, and now you have nothing better to do but head north after Team Snag'em. Team Snag'em leads you to this giant Cipher base out in the desert. It's actually being protected by that big guy from back in Gateon Port. His name is Zook. You battle him and just get denied entry to the Cipher lair from some random bodybuilders. I have no idea why this is the security the place has, instead of those big Cipher peons you saw before. Maybe they're trying to be subtle about their giant pyramid. There's nothing we can do here, so it's off to try and get the Snag Machine back. You bounce around again, stopping at the ONBS to catch up with the kids, and then head out to the outskirts stand for another match with Mirror B. Eventually you'll get tipped off to where the Snag'em hideout is. Coming back to the Team Snag'em hideout gives me some mixed feelings. Yet again, it's another reused location, but it was also kind of underutilized in Pokemon Colosseum, where it served as a post-game bonus area. Something about destroyed and abandoned areas is always fun to explore, but I kinda wish they changed the layout a bit and made it look a little different. Considering it's been half of a decade, you would expect them to have cleaned it up a bit. I'm pretty sure this is the last area from the previous game to be repurposed, thankfully, but running through all these places can really make Pokemon XD feel like a victory lap. Being a second go-around, Gale of Darkness has the benefit of roughing out many of Colosseum's sharp edges. I haven't really spoken about it too much, but a lot of the things Pokemon XD does well is more so on the quality of life side. Things like the Purify Chamber, the extended Shadow Move pool, and the increased team variety help it out a lot in those ways. Even small stuff like allowing the game to be played with the C-Stick is a bit of a bonus. While it seems that the fanbase prefers XD generally, I think that the people that come from Colosseum just feel that the mature and less hand-holdy direction was the better one. I'm sort of a fan of Colosseum more than XD, but don't get me wrong, I think they're both cool for their own reasons, and I'm glad Genius Sonority had a second chance at Ore. It really comes down to if you prefer the vibes of Colosseum or the flexibility of XD. I'd love to hear which ones you prefer and why in the comments. There is a lot of battling to get through here, so this is probably a good time to talk about the soundtrack in XD as well. Tsukasa Tawada returns here again, but there is somewhat of a change in approach. Colosseum and XD both share a lot of music, but the new ones added in the sequel are generally more adventurous feeling, with a more chill guitar in some of the music, but a more orchestrated sound in others. I also noticed that some of the music is re-recorded or redone in some way, which is a nice touch. The best example of this would be the new Cipher battle song, which reuses a similar piano from Colosseum, but adds a bit more grandeur with the sound. You can compare for yourself. They're both solid tracks in their own rights, of course, and you can still hear Pokémon Colosseum's music in the Colosseums. I'm a pretty big fan of Tawada's work in both of these games, so I'm just happy to see that Pokémon XD gave him another opportunity to produce some more music. You might remember back in Phoenix City, we managed to grab this Shadow Lunatone, and I decided to throw it on the team for now. I was using them here and there in the Snag'em hideout, and I really found that it might be what my team was missing. Lunatone is a decently bulky Pokemon with types that my team didn't have, and it has Levitate, which helps a lot when Sandslash eventually gets Earthquake. I can't say I've ever used a Lunatone in any Pokemon game ever, and I've kind of grown attached to this floating JPEG. So I purified them, taught them a few moves, and welcomed them to the team. Say hi to Pete. We like Pete. Something I eventually noticed is that the character models aren't the only thing with improved detail in the time between XD and Colosseum. A lot of the effects for various attacks have been improved. I first noticed this with Psychic, where I had a suspicion that it looked different. Comparing it is clearly much better looking in XD. Getting to the end of the base, we finally take on Gonzap. Gonzap isn't a tough boss by any means, but I did like the direction they took with Team Snag'em as a whole. In Colosseum, they felt like they were mismanaged and just didn't really belong in the story. But here, it kind of makes sense, because they want to be this big bad team of Ore, but Cipher has just stolen that position from them. Gonzap suggests forming sort of an uneasy alliance. Since Michael is so good at battling, he can help them take down Cipher in exchange for the Snag Machine. They both kinda want the same thing. Once you make it back to the Cipher key layer, you can finally snag Zook's Shadow Zangoose and make your way into the base. Just as those big guys try to block you from entering, Snag'em shows up and puts them to sleep with their gloom, finally allowing you inside the Shadow Pokemon Factory. With the Carvana I caught earlier finally evolved, I've got my full squad for this playthrough. Pete the Lunatone, Noki the Breloom, Snapple the Sharpedo, Jam the Sandslash, Pepper the Houndoom, and Neo the Jolteon. I realized I almost had a whole food theme going on with the nicknames. I swear that wasn't on purpose. This is the first location that has more than one Shadow Pokemon per team, but I kept knocking them out on accident. Thankfully Mirror Bee will scoop them up, so I don't have to worry too much. It can be a bit of a hassle to chase him around, but it's not too bad. Pokémon XD very purposefully increases the variety of obtainable Pokemon in the game, but there are some really strange choices for Pokemon toward the end of the game here. Things like a Pidgeotto or Paris show up in Cipher Key Layer, but they're typically used as early game Pokemon in the main series, probably for good reasons. I love these guys, but they're pretty tame selections compared to the late game Pokemon you would expect to see. I also noticed that a lot of the Mons you catch at this Shadow Pokemon Factory are from Kanto. I had an idea that maybe the majority of them were stolen off of the SS Libra, which could have been on a trip from Kanto to Ore. I don't know if any of the NPCs contribute to that idea, but it could be a fun concept. It would make perfect sense to me why there's so many random Kanto Pokemon. After going through dozens of battles here and some fun, simple puzzles, you finally reach the top of the pyramid. Partway through, I felt pretty underleveled, and I had to step away to change up my team's movesets again. You find the TM for Earthquake here, and that means that I should get Protect on a few of my other Pokemon in order to capitalize on it. Leveling and level scaling is going to become more and more of a problem as time goes on here, but we'll get to it when we get there. My team's lack of experience was even more apparent when I got to the boss of the Cipher layer, Admin Gorgon. He's the game's resident Protect Quake guy, but his lowest levels were a few levels higher than my highest. At this point, a lot of Shadow Pokemon know some really powerful Shadow moves, like Shadow Storm, which is like a super-powered Surf. And don't forget, these moves are always super effective. And while I'm happy to finally have the challenge and some more variety, these level spikes are really bad. I took my first loss against him and managed to eke out a win after reorganizing the team. In a huge twist, the leader of Cipher, Greevil, that you've been hearing about, turns out to be that weird old guy, Mr. Verich. They challenge you to come to them at Citadark Isle, a volcanic island off the coast of Gadeon Port, but it's impossible to reach them right now by boat because of the rough seas surrounding it. I like how Gorrigan refuses to tell you how many Shadow Pokemon were made at the factory, but then you find a list on his desk after he leaves. A factory worker also happens to let you know that one last Shadow Pokemon was stolen on the way out. But now that the factory is shut down, we have to find a way to get to Citadark Isle. Before I head into the last leg of Pokémon XD, I wanted to spend some time purifying Pokémon at the lab. I've been visiting the Purify Chamber pretty consistently and upgrading it with more regular Pokémon as I get them. Most of the slots are filled with good enough setups to keep purifying Pokemon. It honestly gets to a point where there's so many notifications at a time that it can feel like a bit of a hassle to clear them out, since you have to go back to the lab to do it. But it is a lot faster and convenient than any other method. I do have some mixed feelings about the Purify Chamber, since it does turn the process somewhat industrial, which is a bit weird considering the whole point is to recover the hearts of Shadow Pokemon. There just isn't really a good answer to deal with so many Shadow Pokemon, so I guess I can't complain. At this point in the game, there actually isn't a lot of direction to point you exactly where to go, but if you can recall, Kaminko and his assistant were working on that robot version of Groudon and Kyogre. The Robo Groudon is useless as we established, but the Kyogre is a working speedboat that was taken to Gadeon Port to be worked on. The robot Kyogre is just what we need to get to Citadark Isle, and I just had to get to the mechanic shop to set it up. Call in a few favors, run a few more errands, yoink, and then it's ready and off to Citadark Isle for the final stretch of XD. Citadark is a gauntlet, with a handful of distinct areas, each with their own set of trainers and puzzles to pour through. From this point on to the end of the story, the game throws dozens of Shadow Pokemon at you. Of the 83 total Pokemon in Gale of Darkness, nearly half of them are snagged here. I wish they had spaced these things out a bit more with the battling and everything to the rest of the game. Spreading out the variety would have been really nice. This is by far the biggest section of XD. Just when you think you've reached the end, there's a whole new area to battle through. You earn experience a lot here, so the team is leveling up fast, but the Pokemon you're fighting are also quickly raising their levels too. Every floor has its own theme to it, starting in this sort of loading dock to the inside of the volcano itself. There's even an area with a sort of storm machine, which explains why the oceans surrounding Citadark Isle have been so treacherous. I do have to appreciate that this area really got a lot of distance out of the puzzle mechanics that have popped up occasionally throughout the rest of the game. I think light puzzles are always fun in JRPGs, other than when they take too long to get through. I don't really understand why the developers felt the need to stuff all of this content into this one location, since there are some really interesting things here that could have been made in the previous areas and made them more special. I can't emphasize just how long this one dungeon is. There's just so much to get through here. It actually took hours to crawl through. These guys are still creeping me out with their weird lankiness. I don't think I'm ever gonna get over how out of place they look. The first rematch with Lavrina wasn't too bad, but each battle gets progressively more difficult, and they'd eventually take me a few tries each. I hit some major roadblocks, especially against Gorrigan and Ardos, the blue guy from earlier. My team was barely meeting level requirements, so it took a lot of strategy and a bit of luck too. I also didn't know this until recording that Shadow Sky doubles the damage of Shadow type moves. That information might have helped, but Lunatone had my only weather move and it wasn't a very fast Pokemon, so hard to say. Sometimes the best plan in Pokemon XD was to just roll the dice on a ball throw and hope that I could steal their shadow Pokemon before they could knock out any more of my guys. When you throw a ball, it always goes first, so if you risk it, you might get lucky. When I lost these fights, I realized I'd forgotten that Pokemon XD works differently than Colosseum when losing a battle. If you catch a shadow Pokemon in Colosseum, it would immediately be placed in your PC. So there were times where you could catch a shadow Pokemon and sort of cheese the game by losing and coming back. You would still have stolen that Pokemon, so it would either be replaced by a regular Pokemon that you can just beat, or it'd be an empty space. Pokemon XD though doesn't give you that opportunity, and if you lose here, you don't keep anything that you stole. One of the last Cipher peons that you battle here has a team that you could actually almost entirely have yourself. Every Pokemon on this team is obtainable in the game somehow. That is, excluding their Shadow Dugtrio, but I guess you could have that one soon. I wonder if it was on purpose. It's hard to tell if it was just because they felt like having these Pokemon. It's just a weird detail I noticed. The only admin left was Eldis, and this is where I hit a real brick wall. Suddenly, my team that had just hit level 40 had to face off against a team that were 5 levels on average higher than me. Plus, the 2 Shadow Pokemon rule here is brought up to 4 for his team, and I could barely do any damage. It was obvious I was just way too low level for this. This led me to doing a very long grinding session back on Mount Battle, clearing off the first 7 areas until their levels were higher than anything on Citadark Island. Grinding is a pretty big problem in both Ore games, but Pokemon XD's structure puts all of that grinding at the end of the game. It's consistently easy until these last few boss battles. I think maybe I could have sliced in some Mount Battle grinding or side objectives in some way along the way, but it would just serve to make the rest of the easy sections of the game even more easy. It reminds me of some of the biggest level spikes in the main games, like in Diamond and Pearl's champion battles, but at least in that game you can run your face into the Elite Four until you win. Combat in Pokemon XD is a lot slower than the average Pokemon game, and so these animations can get really grating when you need to grind. Putting in so much time into Mount Battle meant that I was just stuck waiting around for these things to play out. After a solid 2 hours, the team was almost level 50, and finally ready for a rematch. Artis was much more manageable here, and it was finally time to head upstairs to challenge Greevil. First is the long-awaited battle with Shadow Lugia. This operates pretty similarly to your typical legendary battle from the games at the time. Lugia's got an insanely low catch rate of 3, the lowest it goes. Just before heading to Citadark, Professor Crane gave you a Master Ball, which you could use for this battle in particular to just skip it, but I had this silly idea that it would make more sense to use that ball in the next fight to make it easier. This led me to a drawn-out battle throwing nearly every Pokeball I had until Lugia finally cooperated with me. Greevil understandably doesn't like that you stole his ultimate weapon in an Ultra Ball you bought from the convenience store, and sets you off against his actual team. He proceeded to smoke my entire party with a team comprised entirely of Shadow Pokemon, 3 of which are legendary birds. But that's not a big deal. I'd expected to lose here, and I needed to go buy more Pokeballs anyways. You don't have to deal with the Shadow Lugia fight again, and you could even turn it around and use it in the next fight, but I did want to finish with my original team. On my 3rd attempt, I managed to catch most of the team. Unlike the other Pokemon in the game, Greevil can be refought afterward, instead of having to wait around for Mirror B, so I didn't worry too much about it. His Articuno and Tauros didn't make it, so I'll have to come back later. Having saved the Master Ball, I was able to skip catching Zapdos, and that only left Moltres. Soon, Greavil was done for. After the match, Ardos tries to escape with Greavil and blow up the island with Michael on it. But Eldis comes back and decides sacrificing everyone on the island isn't worth it when everything Cipher had built had already been dismantled. It turns out that the admins are sons of Greavils, and they all decide that the battle is lost, and it's time for Cipher to finally give up the ghost. The storms surrounding Citadark Isle are cleared, and Ore can finally return to peace for good. After completing the game, there are still a few things left to do. The post-game section isn't quite as long as it was in Pokémon Colosseum, but let's still have a look. The first thing to do was head back to Greavil's lair and get Tauros and Articuno back. With 82 Shadow Pokémon caught so far, there's still that one that was stolen back in the Cipher Key layer. Of course, the guy who's been stealing Pokémon the whole time has it, and he's been sitting on the top of the lighthouse in Gadeon Port. I'm honestly kind of glad to see this location get used, since I came here right at the start of the game and just assumed that nothing was going to happen here. Mirror B's team consists of 5 level 57 Ludicolo and a level 55 Shadow Dragonite. This really shouldn't be an issue, but I just don't have enough fast Pokemon that can deal super effective damage on the Ludicolos. But this time I have some new friends I can capitalize on. I marched back to the Pokemon Center and picked up the legendaries I got from Greavil, and it made snagging Shadow Dragonite way easier. It was nice to actually get to use Shadow Lugia here too. Lugia doesn't operate the same as the other Shadow Pokemon. It's got a maxed out heart meter that won't budge no matter how long you choose to use it. But if you've managed to organize the Purify Chamber in a way that has every category maxed out in tempo, dropping Lugia inside will instantly purify it. It's actually a bit of an anticlimax, because when you think about it, they hyped out this whole thing. If you wanted to, you could throw in 36 Pidgeys and dismantle all of the work that Cipher did. There's no big ceremony, no special animation, just the folks at the lab coming up and giving Michael an attaboy.
That's pretty cool, I guess.
That was a bit anticlimactic, so how about a fun fact? Did you know that the only unique special edition of the GameCube that was released in North America featured Shadow Lugia? It's just a standard silver GameCube, but with the Pokémon XD cover plate, and so it's not that special, but it is the only one released in where I live. This model also is one of the later generation GameCubes that doesn't have digital video out, and it doesn't let you swap the cover plates, unlike the earlier ones. And if you pop these little pins right here and get the cover plate out, did you know that too? Little bonus fact. I had a friend that owned one of these back when it was new, and it's become a bit of a collector's item nowadays. But realistically, it's not that special. With Lugia purified, there's still one last location to visit. Egon from Agate Village battles you with his Pikachu's children, and then decides you're good enough to test your skills at the newly reopened Ore Coliseum. The battle simulator from the very beginning cutscene of the game is actually Ore Coliseum, where you finish the game off. Ore Coliseum was included in Pokémon Colosseum, but it was reserved just for the battle modes. In XD, however, it features a series of specially designed Colosseum battles with a similar rule set to the battle towers in the main games. These challenges are really tough, and every trainer has some cleverly designed lineups. There's only one problem here. My team is also a solid 10 levels below the minimum cap of 60, and it makes my team's chance of winning nearly impossible. So once again, I was off to the mountain of battling for some grinding. But quickly, I ran into an issue. Area 6 of Mount Battle has Pokemon as high as level 45, but Area 7 has Pokemon that are just below 60. This put my level 50 Pokemon team in a terrible situation because I was just too high level to effectively gain experience in Area 6, but not consistently strong enough to train in Area 7. I didn't know where else to go for training, and so I kinda just gave up on this. You know, there was a point where I would happily grind Pokemon for hours to get max IVs, EVs, move sets and everything like that, but now is just simply not that time. I tried grinding here to get them to level 60, but after 3 hours of battling, I only got Pete and Snapple to like level 54, and I decided it wasn't worth it. But that's when it struck me. We have technology. Thanks to my good old Game Boy to GameCube link cable, I could transfer over a team that would be infinitely better than anything I could get in the same amount of time. After you finish the game, Phoenix City opens up for trading with the Game Boy Advance games, and I took a minute to gather up a team that was more than ready to face the challenges of Ore Coliseum, and I sent them over to Pokémon XD. This made my life infinitely easier, and I managed to take on the first series of battles in the Coliseum without much of a hassle. The battles after this first series are still really hard even with a well-developed team, but at least I could get through the battle with Lavrina. The reason I wanted to do this in the first place was that it sets you off to do the last bit of post-game content. This short scenario involves Michael finding that the Pokemon of Ore have suddenly lost their speech due to the weird translators that show up on their necks all of a sudden. You travel between Agate Village and the rest of the major towns and get Kaminko to help solve this crisis. Eventually you find that it was an old invention of his, distributed without his knowledge, and after you manage to save all of the overworld Pokemon's voices, you can get a lucky egg for your troubles. It's a really strange segment to round out Gale of Darkness, and it involves a ton of walking back and forth between every area and Kaminko's manor. The only thing I could think of is that it gives you a good chance to grind out the remaining Shadow Pokemon to purify, since every step allows the purification machine to add up. There is also one last thing you can do, which is complete the Mount Battle Challenge, and that'll give you one of the 3 Johto starters. It is a small bonus for a quite long task though, so I won't be doing it here. But with everything else cleared up, there's only one last Pokemon left to purify. In my Pokemon Coliseum video, I went over the battle mode pretty briefly, but it's been pretty much gutted here in comparison. What you're left with is just the group battles mode through link cables, with no Mount Battle Challenge or anything of the sort. At least you can still do the 12v12 battles. It's nice that they updated the trainer models from the Game Boy games, but without the rest of the Mount Battle challenges and stuff like that, the mode is still pretty limited. The post-game is really tied to the story mode instead, with the Ore Coliseum, battle simulations, and battle bingo. But it's all very much there for the sake of doing it, and it doesn't provide much incentive in terms of story or anything like that. With nothing else left to do, you can choose to harvest your game for the Shadow Pokemon you caught through the story mode. In Generation 3, Lugia is only obtainable through this game, much like Ho-Oh was in Coliseum, and I'm sure that alone would make it worth the trouble for some folks. But with all that said and done, that's the end of the line for Pokémon XD.
Darkness has fallen over the land of Ore.
Gale of Darkness might not be a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination, but it and its prequel left such an impression on the broader Pokemon franchise. They're black sheep, weird spin-off games that still resemble the original RPGs, but come in a completely different style. Pokémon XD in particular did a lot to improve on the established Shadow Pokemon concept. They're both great for their own reasons, with some of my favorite songs from the series, some lovable characters, and Ore just being such an interesting area to explore. Gale of Darkness just feels a bit rushed to me at times, with these weird segmented areas and a lot of backtracking to previous locations, but the quality of life features and vastly improved Pokemon variety do give it an edge in those ways. I just wish that Ore was a bit more thoroughly explored here, because a lot of the coolest areas either get pushed to the end of the game or are weirdly small. I would have loved to spend more time at the shipwreck, or have more reasons to explore Gadeon Port instead of retracing the highlights of Colosseum. There's something about the seedy underbelly of the Ore region that I wish was fleshed out even further. Instead of the focus on the ways that the region has advanced, imagine if Gadeon Port's Krabby Club was secretly a shadow Pokemon speakeasy connected to the lighthouse for distribution. It could have made for a cool dungeon to explore. Without places like the Under, XD's world feels much more sanitized. I do still prefer the general vibe of that first game. If you enjoy Pokemon XD more because it has better battles or the battle simulators, stuff like that, I totally get it. It's just Colosseum has that cool, different aesthetic. I don't think I'll ever get over the scooter. I don't think we need to see Shadow Pokemon or Cipher come back, but I would love to see a brand new team take a more mature angle with Pokemon. The series to me has really settled into its own established brand these days, and always seems to be kind of afraid to bend the rules. And while they are experimenting in the gameplay department, I just think that the tone has become a bit stagnant. The average Pokemon fan is well into their adulthood at this point, so I think the series could at least dabble in some more mature ideas. I'm not saying it has to be gritty and dark, but just a little bit of that spice would, I think, make the series a bit more interesting these days. With the announcement that these games are finally coming back with the Switch 2, I'm pretty excited to see if there's renewed interest from fans. There's just a lot to these games that's worth preserving. I hope you enjoyed this long look in Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and boosted its reach so that it can find more people. And if you want to see more videos like this in the future, subscribe to the channel. But for now, thank you once again for watching, and take care.